Hey guys, it's Mr. Wise, and it's time for our nightly addition to our PowerPoint from today. We're going to be talking about the Cold War in Asia and a lot of the stuff we saw in the crash course, but I want to give you some extra details on a few things and hopefully clear up some of the information that we've covered. So, again, the Korean War, we actually talked about the Korean War, I think Wednesday, but a few things that we want to definitely talk about. So, after the Korean War and 4 years of fighting, led by, again, the United States successfully containing communism, that's what we said. Remember, that's kind of the spin of the Korean War. Yeah, we didn't win, we didn't lose, it was a stalemate, ended up back at the 38th parallel, but at least Truman and Eisenhower, actually at the end of the presidency, the United States could claim we contained communism, so we achieved that. Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam, and actually, to be honest with you, the most the people's favorite. And we'll talk about the elections here in a second, but he was fighting for the liberation of Vietnam, but also Indochina, the area surrounding Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, etc. The French, since the days of colonialism, guys had claimed this region, and surprisingly, after World War II, the French didn't give up their colonial claims, which, for the most part, even Britain with India and other places, took time. But, these things had been given up. But the French were stubbornly retaining this area. And I really don't have a good answer as to why the French did this. But again, remember that a lot of things that would make normal sense were very clouded during this period as a result of our the Cold War, and America just essentially on all questions we were going to be anti-communist. So communists defeated the French forces, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This battle was really a turning point, guys, and it's really in a lot of ways considered the start of U.S. involvement with regard to Vietnam. So the U.S. gave much aid to the French, trying to prevent this communist expansion, right? Because remember, the anti-communism basically was above all in everything that we considered. John Foster Dulles wanted U.S. bombers to aid the French, possibly nuclear weapons. Scary thought, but thankfully didn't happen. Eisenhower refused, again fearing that our ally, the British, wouldn't support this action. So what you had is a multinational conference at Geneva. It's a Geneva conference we mentioned previously, and the decision was we're going to split Vietnam at the 17th parallel. And Ho Chi Minh accepted it. And the reason why he accepted it, guys, is because of this, that in 2 years they were going to have elections. And he was confident that he was going to win those elections. In the South, again, the leader that the United States backed, No Dinh Diem, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation, guys, but he took control. And the only really thing that this guy had going for him was that he was anti-communist. I mean, this guy, in a lot of ways, guys, was a dictator. He was cruel to his people, especially the Buddhist majority in South Vietnam. He was hated by most of the people, but again, for the United States, he wasn't communist. So, in a lot of ways, Ho Chi Minh, in hindsight, guys, in retrospect, was the best leader for Vietnam and the people's choice. But unfortunately, we chose the anti-communist Diem. And again, he didn't hold elections because he really, had a good idea he was going to lose those elections. The communist guerrillas in the south, the Viet Cong or the VC, increased. Oops, sorry guys, I'm having a little problem here. Increased their campaign against Diem, and again, as with Korea, China well, this is a little different, but China continued to support for the North, right? So China is going to support North Vietnam. China is going to support North Korea as well. Soviets as well are going to support the North in these two issues, Korea and Vietnam. So kind of simplifying things there. John Foster Dulles at the time, the response was, remember, we have NATO already. The creation of SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, kind of to prop up Diem's regime. Britain and France were included, and Australia and some other nations. Only the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan in the region signed this agreement on the side of the United States and the Western allies. U.S. pledge was to prevent communist expansion, specifically in Asia, Eisenhower sent in military advisors. So this is the beginning of our involvement in Vietnam with military advisors. We'll get into the full-blown Vietnam elements, guys, tomorrow a little bit, Friday, and then Monday and Tuesday we'll talk more about that. As you can see, Vietnam, guys, very unique geography. You see Saigon down here. You see, you might think, just assuming that this could be easily like a continental one nation, but of course you have Laos here, Thailand, Cambodia for a variety of reasons. Language, culture, ethnicity. You're going to see these different nations here, but again, what we call it in geography is an elongated state. Vietnam has this unique shape, and here we see the dividing line. This is North Vietnam, and this is South Vietnam. So you can begin to imagine the confusion when we talk about borders and wars. There is this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which basically ran through Laos and Cambodia and supplied the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong. So that's going to create a lot of problems for waging this war for the United States. One of the biggest things too, guys, besides our notion of in our fear of communism, which just goes along with that, is the idea that the fear was that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, that others would fall, just like a row of dominoes. And as you can see, China, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, all the way through, guys. The notion was that we had to stop communism, and this goes right along with the rollback theory that we talked about previously. But really, right here is it's kind of a combination of that with containment, but referred to as the domino theory because of the fear that so many countries would fall if one of the dominoes fell. And so that's why we were trying to toe the line, so to speak, with regard to Vietnam. So let's shift gears a little bit, talk about Latin America. Now, in Latin America, guys, you had a president, Jacob Arbenz Guzman, who had nationalized 500,000 acres of uh, land belonging to a United States company, the United Fruit Company, and he was beginning to show communist leanings, so that definitely would concern the United States. So the United Fruit Company basically said, you know what, and it's funny, it's Guatemala, but this American Fruit Company says we got to step in. Think about Roosevelt corollary. Think about the fact that America has traditionally been very heavy-handed in Latin America, and you can imagine that the United States is going to intervene. So now we have this thing called the CIA, right? That's been in place since 1950 with the NSC 68, right? So the CIA actually helped overthrow the Guatemalan leader Guzman. World opinion condemned this. Even allies like Britain and France, and the United Nations condemned this as well. Nixon had to call off an 8-nation goodwill tour of Latin America because he was met by hostile mobs. So it just goes to show you guys how this was kind of just like, yeah, United States, we can't just continue to do whatever the heck we want. This is the mid 20th century now, and again now goes back to this reputation that we already earned earlier periods, the Colossus of the North, this overbearing power that would kind of bully around the nations of Latin America. So naturally, this contributed to that moniker. Prior to 1959, U.S. companies were active in Cuba. 90% of Cuban mines, 40% of Cuban sugar operations were owned by U.S. corporations. Cuba actually had the highest standard of living in Latin America and was among the countries with the highest literacy rates. You see this guy, this young Castro. I like to say if you guys know who the actor Liam Neeson is, I really think that they're doppelgangers with one another. Anyways, Fidel Castro took control of Cuba. The oppressive leader fled, who was pre-Castro. Castro visited the United States, but Eisenhower refused to see him, so that's a little bit of a snub there. He wasn't sure if Castro was a communist, and again, you can see how communism clouds everything, guys. I mean, just receive the guy, and see what he has to say, But for the United States, no, we cannot support any communists. We cannot, even, host them or so this, definitely is a situation where, well, at least Nixon met with him, but eventually Castro confiscated these American-owned property, what we call it, nationalized some of these areas and the mines and the sugar. and Khrushchev decided to aid Cuba. Khrushchev saw that the relationship between Cuba and the United States was deteriorating, and certainly Castro could use an ally. So in 1960, Khrushchev publicly extended the Soviet nuclear umbrella to Cuba. Khrushchev stated that the Monroe Doctrine was dead and he would shower missiles on the U.S. if it attacked. So remember that bury United States economically? That was kind of a rhetoric about the economics. This was literally now 1960 shows how quickly things have changed, guys. No more peaceful coexistence when Khrushchev's saying they're going to shower missiles on the U.S. if they attacked its ally Cuba. And I'm sure part of this is Khrushchev's anger that the United States was being hypocritical. We had missiles in Turkey, and the Soviets simply wanted to install missiles in their allies' nation to protect their ally. That is at least the way they spun it. Certainly, though, you can imagine from the U.S. perspective only that missiles in Cuba definitely doesn't promote American security. So with that, just like Guatemala, guys, the United States begins with the CIA to plot an overthrow of Fidel Castro. So U.S. persuaded the Organization of American States to condemn communist infiltration. So what we had was a response by the government. Congress responded with $500 million in aid. So essentially they were attempting a Latin American Marshall Plan. Was not successful like the actual Marshall Plan. It failed miserably, partially because it was underfunded and partially because the Latin American countries were not the relationship between Latin American countries and the United States was not the one like the Western European democracies. All right, guys, so let's wrap this up. Evaluating Eisenhower in general. So you have a few things here. One, he did further the cause of the New Deal. He didn't take it away. America continued to prosper during the Eisenhower years. As opposed to most lame duck presidents, Eisenhower showed more skilled leadership during his last 2 years than at any other time. Democrats actually controlled Congress for a large part of Eisenhower's presidency. He actually used the veto a lot of times, guys, 169 times, and was overridden only twice. So very active in his last couple of years, which for some presidents that's not the case. Public works projects, the federal highway project, especially, guys, billions and billions of dollars to build our highway system, which is really something that is a large part of our lives as roads continue to be improved and redone and expanded. For the most part, he worked with Khrushchev to tone down Cold War hostilities during much of the 1950s, although things did sour toward the end. Major criticisms has been his seeming recklessness with regard to massive retaliation and brinksmanship. Although encouraged by Dulles, Eisenhower did support those programs. Nuclear diplomacy and ending the Korean War, a little bit heavy-handed. Eisenhower did exercise restraint in the affairs despite having been a top general. So he did, he never actually used the nuclear card, so we got to give him credit for that. Perhaps his greatest failings was his anemic stance on civil rights. Remember, although he did send the military in with regard to the Little Rock Nine, he did not extensively intend to be a civil rights president. Until 1957, African Americans struggled to get federal assistance for civil rights. One thing that we kind of skipped over in the notes, Operation Wetback, happened during Eisenhower's watch, where a lot of Mexicans were targeted without due process because this was a response to if you remember, the World War II Bracero program. A lot of Mexican Americans had stayed in the United States, and Operation Wetback was kind of like a Red Scare for Hispanics, where many of them were targeted and sent back to Mexico without due process. Loss of funding and lands for Native Americans. So on civil rights, not just African Americans, but Hispanics and Native Americans, Eisenhower had a poor record. Well, just got it in under the wire, guys. 14 minutes. Hopefully you enjoy it tonight or in the morning, and we'll see you tomorrow.